Hi, and welcome to Responsa Radio, where you ask and we answer questions of Jewish law in modern times. I'm Rabbi Avi Killip, Executive Vice President at Hadar, here with Rabbi Ethan Tucker, Rosh Yeshiva at Hadar, a center for Jewish learning and community building based in New York City. You can check us out and learn more at hadar.org. So we have a really juicy and I think, as usual, simultaneously narrow and big question today. Mm-hmm. The question today is going to be about weddings and attending a wedding.
Okay.
The questioner writes, a close friend is getting married in a church, and I'm very conflicted about what to do. I have always avoided entering churches as I was taught that this was asur, forbidden, but I feel terrible skipping my friend's wedding. What would you advise? What are the relevant halachic considerations and sources? Okay, so he was raised with the idea of not entering into a church. I've avoided entering churches because it's asur. It's forbidden to enter a church. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that. Where is that coming from? Yeah. And how should this listener take that into account as she decides whether or not to attend the wedding of a close friend?
Yeah. I want to actually just ask your and the listeners' indulgence for a minute for just sort of a moment of introduction before we get into the nitty-gritty of this topic. I think it's really important to talk respectfully and honestly when we talk about religions and other faiths. It's not always easy to do both of those at the same time. I feel like the goal is to aim never to insult anyone, but also not to paper over key areas of concern or divides. And let me just say a word about Christianity from a Jewish perspective, which is simultaneously two things. First of all, Christianity, as far as Judaism is concerned, is one of the great allies, has been one of the great allies in spreading knowledge of the Bible, devotion to God's word, the notion that all people are created in the image of God and that they're all worthy recipients of God's love. That's a big deal. That's a big overlap on some major commitments in Judaism. And simultaneously, Christianity has been the source of supersessionist thinking about Judaism that has been a source at various points in history of tremendous violence, not only towards Judaism, but towards Jews as a people. And, you have at root, from a Christian perspective, the Jewish rejection of Jesus as the Messiah has often been seen as an unforgivable trespass and betrayal. And from a Jewish perspective, the elevation of Jesus to part of the Godhead was seen as a classic form of idolatry that served as its own kind of betrayal of the God of Israel. So to say there's a lot of hurt feelings here is to make it a little trivial. But one of the tragedies and dramas of Jewish-Christian relation is actually holding both of those things. There is tremendous confluence on certain key points, and then tremendous division and pain, and from the Jewish perspective, victimhood at the hands of the violence of the church and many Christians. And then that all lives with Jews living out those questions and those experiences in the variables of their lives, right? Many Jewish lives were lived in Christendom with Christian neighbors, with Christian business partners. And this question is just sort of actually the latest interaction in that regard. And an example, we live in a time, thank God, where most Jews living in Christian contexts do not feel overly threatened by the Christian environment. And often, as is the case of the questioner, there's close friendships. There's an assumption, controlling for everything else that we're gonna share our lives. I just want to start with that comment that I think we're going to try to have an honest, no pulling punches conversation, but one that hopefully is, respectful.
Yeah, we also don't know from this question. We know that they're close friends, but we don't know actually anything more about the context or whether, you were saying many Jews today don't experience Christianity as sort of like pressing onto them. But that's sort of different in different contexts and in different parts of the country. Having grown up in Atlanta, Georgia, there were, we showed up at ball games where we were told, like, bow your heads in Jesus' name before we start playing. And we're like, what do we do? And how do we respond in this moment? And, some people really do have situations where Christianity is being pushed on you. So it's not that it totally doesn't come up. And we don't know for this person who's saying, I avoided churches, whether that was like a point of, I'm just following the rules. I was just taught this as a rule, so I don't go to churches, or whether there was some, like, I've been pressured to go to church and I've avoided that. And do I want to compromise that, resistance in order to show up for this friend? We don't have a sense of sort of what's going on for her experientially here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, with all those caveats, let's try to break it down as we usually do. And here, I think we basically have to break down the response, as it were, into two components. The first is when the questioner says, I was taught you're not allowed to go into a church, that is basically based on two components. One is some version of a claim that Christianity is a form of idolatry, that is a forbidden form of worship, and that entering into the building of such a form of worship is a forbidden thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to actually take those two things apart, right? I think question one we want to ask is Christianity idolatry, or the rabbinic term avodah zarah, foreign worship, in some way that is forbidden? And even if it is there a prohibition on entering such a space, right? Or what's the basis for that? And under what circumstances can you do it? So let's start with the first one.
Yeah.
Like actually just thinking about the core theological question of Christianity. There are schematically three ways of thinking about Christianity when you talk about it from a Jewish normative perspective.
Three is a good Christian number.
Yes, indeed. Number one is to view Christianity as a form of idolatry and totally forbidden. And the root of the idolatry would be a mix of basically elevating Jesus into the Godhead, right? Seeing the Trinity as having multiple persons, as it were, and therefore losing the monotheistic thread, and potentially, certainly in forms of Catholic worship and other denominations, if there are crucifixes that very clearly have an image of a man.
Maybe there are actual idols.
Yeah, and to the extent there's bowing to them or genuflecting in front of them, various things like that, that may be actually, yes, an idol, right, on a very physical level. So, right, one category is just to say, yeah, I mean, this is sort of a religion, that highly intersects with the Hebrew Bible and a lot of things that we know and are familiar with, but basically it's a form of idolatry that is not really different from the things laid out in the Bible as such. A second category is to say, well, this is not appropriate for Jews. Jews have a kind of higher standard placed on them when it comes to monotheism and purity of relationship with the God of Israel. But maybe it's actually okay for Gentiles, for non-Jews, to have a little more of a fluid sense of you got to believe and worship the creator of the world, but if other entities are somehow conjoined with that or mixed in, that's actually okay. It's sort of a formulation of it's idolatry for us, but not for them.
Yeah.
But a second option is that's a perfectly fine religion for you.
Yeah.
But it's not acceptable.
Meaning it's not like deviant. It's not going to destroy the world. It's just not Judaism.
Correct. And it would be actually a grave sin for a Jew to engage in that kind of worship for a Jew. The same way we might say, like, if someone who's not Jewish, like, works on Shabbat, that's fine. Maybe we might think they would get some benefit from it, but, we have no objection to that. Whereas we might say, well, that would be a grave thing to do for a Jew. Maybe the form of Christian worship is, understood to be in the same way, or Christian theology or the Trinity, et cetera. And then the third view is, It's a perfectly valid, non-idolatrous form of worship. You can't do it as a Jew just because being Jewish means being obligated in the mitzvot and, all sorts of other things, the way the overwhelming majority of Jewish thinkers have thought about Islam, which is to say, that's great. We love that those people are, that's their theology and their approach and their practice. And of course I would go into a mosque. What's wrong with a mosque? It's people who are not Jewish worshiping the God of the world.
So it's bad, neutral, positive. Those are the three categories?
Yeah, maybe I might sharpen it even further as there's bad and positive on the ends. And then there's sort of we each stay in our own lane. Mm-hmm. In any event, you're staying in your own lane, even in the positive version. Right. But there's a notion of, in the second model, if a Jew is engaged with Christian worship or even Christian worship spaces, that's actually the prohibition of idolatry for them, even though, again, this other person lives in a different universe. You're right.
So it's idolatry for everyone is
correct.
The bad.
Even for them.
It's idolatry for no one is the positive.
Correct.
And the middle is it's idolatry for me, but it's worship for you.
Yeah. So schematically, those are three ways I want our listeners to understand. I want to now just share a little bit about, who are some of the figures who weighed in on that and how did they talk about it? So in camp one, this is idolatry and it's totally forbidden, is the Rambam. Is Maimonides. Mm-hmm. Maimonides repeatedly throughout his writings basically goes out of his way to say Christianity is idolatry.
And for him, that's Christianity in particular in comparison as opposed to
Islam, which he thinks is great.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, basically Rambam would have preferred if the entire world, I think the Rambam's ideal actually would have been if the entire world was made up of Jews and Muslims. That would have been his ideal world. Uh-huh. Okay. It was monotheism was at its pure peak in Islam. He thought it was great. It was overall, an intellectual and a strong cultural religion he thought was great.
And for listeners who wouldn't be familiar, he's in a Muslim context, right?
Correct.
Does he interact with a lot of Christians?
So it would be here and there, but let's put it this way. He's not living in Christendom.
Yeah.
Right. The overlords, as it were, of his society are Muslim. The Rambam has this most extreme position where he says, any city that has a church, you can't even go into that city. Now, you can imagine this is not going to be very viable.
It's going to be hard to uphold in America.
Yeah. Or for the Ashkenazi Jews in Europe living, a couple hundred miles north of him. So it's a little bit of it's an easy claim for him to make on some level, given
Although
where
there's
he lives.
something about that claim that it's so extreme that actually it makes maybe it makes it easier to not worry about that consideration. It's once you say I can't go to the city, then that's impossible. I might as well go to my friend's wedding. I don't know.
Well, he does add here, he too is aware of this. He's like, well, but what are you going to do? That's in theory the law. But basically, if you're stuck living in some Christian city, what are you going to do? But he's sort of if you could structure your life to avoid contact, right, with that religion, that is ideally what you could do. Okay, so that's model one. I think you can see, for the Rambam, again, we'll get to the second question of, so what about entering the house? But for the Rambam, it's pretty clear. Going into a church is going into a house of idolatry.
Yeah.
Okay? And so to the extent that's a problem, there's no ambiguity there.
This is a good time to take a quick break. We'll get right back to this episode. But first, I want to let you know about an upcoming program with Hadar that you will love. The Hadar National Shabbaton, January 30th to February 1st in East Brunswick, New Jersey. This is a Shabbat of powerful davening, engaging learning, delicious meals, and great kids programming. Come connect with an incredible network of people working together to build more meaningful Jewish lives. Visit hadar.org/Shabbaton for more information. Now let's dive back in.
Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, Rabbeinu Tam, one of the great Ashkenazi Tosafists, he's in 12th century France. He is dealing with a more local problem, which is basically Jews and Christians are often in business arrangements with one another. Mm-hmm. In fact, Jews are often making loans to Christians. It's not the only thing they're doing with them, but it's one of the things they're doing with them. And one of the things you sometimes do when you lend money is make the other person swear that they will pay you back. Okay, to reinforce it and get them to take it seriously on their own terms and their frame of reference. But the problem is, when the Christians are swearing, they are potentially explicitly or implicitly taking an oath that is maybe talking about saints, maybe mentioning Jesus, maybe swearing on the Gospels.
And you kind of need them to do that because it doesn't do a lot of good to swear to someone else's God. You got to swear to your own God.
Right. So you would prefer, of course, like what the Jews would prefer is, can you just swear by the creator of the world and call it there? Because that we agree on. And a lot of times it seems like that did happen. But Rabbeinu Tam basically sort of wants to know, is there a way, or he's trying to navigate a way, can people cause their business partner to take an oath? Okay. And there is actually a verse in the Torah that says, right, V'shem Elohim acherim lo tazkiru, don't mention the names of other gods. We had our earlier episode about mentioning the names of other gods. But the verse continues, lo yishama al picha, they shouldn't be heard literally on your mouth, but understood also to mean they shouldn't be heard on your account. You shouldn't be the cause of making someone else take an oath to an idol.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the context of this, Rabbeinu Tam says, yeah, but wait a minute. Actually, if you think about this for a minute, what is the Christian actually doing? They're not taking an oath to Baal. They're not taking an oath to Chemosh, the god of Moab, right?
Yeah.
The way the Bible would think about this. What they're actually doing is sort of swearing by God, but also throwing in some other entity. And while there is a Talmudic passage that makes clear that Jews are not allowed to do that, okay? You can't worship God and Moshe. Right? That's not allowed. But the Talmud never is clear that that is anything other than a restriction on Jews, says Rabbeinu Tam. He's trying to read into the silence. And basically wants to say, maybe Gentiles, non-Jews, maybe they are not forbidden from the practice of shituf. Shituf meaning to join
like
two
adding
things together.
Some extra entity to God.
Adding something else to the Godhead. Maybe Jews have to keep a clear Godhead, but maybe Gentiles can sort of have like a little bit of a pantheon as long as it's clear that the chief real God is in there.
Okay, so long as God is God, God can have some
entourage or something like that.
Side
a trinity,
features.
perhaps. Now, Rabbeinu Tam's language is a little unclear, okay, because he actually never mentions Jesus in this analysis or language. He uses the term kideshim, which seems like it's some kind of derogatory term because kadesh means a male prostitute in the Bible, but it sounds like kiddoshim, which is a word you might use to describe saints.
Is he not saying Jesus in particular because of the context he's in? He doesn't want to be on the record?
It could be, right? This is all unclear. It's not clear. Is he afraid? Is that what he means? Is he only defending it? Like, might he be like, well, if the Christian mentions Jesus, then you can't do that. But if he's willing to only mention a saint or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right, then that's okay. That's the fuzziness. But Rabbeinu Tam at least launches that second model we talked about, which is the notion of maybe actually the way to think about Christians and Jews is that Jews have a requirement of a certain pure monotheism, whereas Jews can tolerate Christians on their own terms, having a more complex Godhead. And in its extreme form, you could even say, The Trinity is fine for Christians, just not for Jews.
So this feels like sort of expanding what we think of internally as like pluralism.
Yes.
To Christians, right? On Passover, I don't eat rice and the Sephardim do eat rice and the Christians eat bread. Okay, like we all have our rules.
Correct. I think pluralism is really a helpful term to try to draw out what we're talking about here. Because a real pluralism would say, that's a great and perfectly fine system for you to do, right? I endorse it. That's wonderful. And Rabbeinu Tam might be saying that. But Rabbeinu Tam also might be in a very local way just saying, yeah, here's why you can make them take the oath on the business deal. It's not that really Christianity isn't idolatry. It's just, it's not that big a deal to cause someone else to take an oath that
He's
includes—
finding a loophole for a thing.
Yeah.
Like a contract of adhesion. He's like, well, I need to find a way to make this possible, so I'll figure it out.
Yeah, and it might be a very limited claim, which is vis-a-vis an oath, this is not your problem. So this becomes a huge debate in how to read Rabbeinu Tam, okay? The Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, seems to read Rabbeinu Tam in the expansive way, which is to say, Christianity just really isn't a form of idolatry for them at all. The way we see that this seems to be what the Ramah means is a kind of entertaining little data point, which is that Jews in the Middle Ages, one of the things they were in the business of was selling crucifixes.
Naturally.
There was a market, right? It's like they found the market and Jews
it's
often
like
had
Christmas songs?
Exactly. Meaning not only crucifixes, but, they sold stuff.
Yeah.
And that would be among the things they might sell.
It is kind of surprising.
It is surprising. And the question is is that allowed? Like, can the rabbis justify that? And of course, if you really think Christianity is idolatry, well, then for Christians, then you're kind of aiding and abetting.
You're making idols.
Yeah, you're aiding and abetting their sin, which you're not allowed to do. So, there's sort of two pathways of justifying that. One is, well, they could just buy a crucifix from someone else. So you're not really aiding and abetting. This is the category
Seems a little cheap. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lifnei iver, not putting a stumbling block before the blind, which as a general rule, we say if a person could pick up the thing on their own, it's not putting a stumbling block before the blind if you hand it to them. In any event, that's one thing. But another thing, which the Ramah seems to say at one point is, yeah, today we don't necessarily really hold that it's idolatry for them. And therefore, their crucifix is not actually a forbidden item, okay? And the Shach and other later authorities, go in this direction. Rav Eliezer Melamed is an example of a contemporary authority who he's like, yeah, that seems to be what Rabbeinu Tam means. It's certainly what most people thought he meant. And that's how to read him. The Noda B'Yehuda, Rav Yechezkel Lando in 18th century Prague, goes ballistic over this and says that is not what Rabbeinu Tam meant. Rabbeinu Tam was offering the narrow reading. Yeah. He's just trying to find a way to get you to do an oath, and we can tolerate that. But of course, Christianity is idolatry for them. Basically, the Noda B'Yehuda thinks like the Rambam about Christianity, but is willing to buy the Rabbeinu Tam argument around the oath. So this is where there's some tussle over where do you put, is Rabbeinu Tam really different from the Rambam or is he not? But that's why I say schematically there is this second view, which some people definitely adopt. Christianity, idolatry for Jews, but not idolatry for Christians.
Okay.
Third model would be to go all the way and say, this is a great different religion, right? That has no problem. So here the main entrant is Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri in Provence, 13th, 14th century. People argue over what he meant also. But if we take at sort of a surface level here, the Meiri innovates a whole way of talking about other faiths in a way that kind of grounds our assessment of the other faith as to whether the practitioners of that faith basically are decent people who have a legal system that honors everyone equally and they are bounded by a moral code. I sometimes translate this idiomatically as people you would be thrilled to leave your kids with for a week. I'll give you his language, and you can sort of compare and contrast with what we see today. So like an example of his language is he'll say, nations that are bound by the ways of religion and who believe in the reality of the unity of God and God's power, even if they have a few theological things where they're kind of mixed up and confused from our perspective, none of the Talmudic laws about idolaters apply to them. Okay. So the broad reading of the Meiri, which a lot of people take, is what he's really saying is it's not really idolatry. And he has another passage somewhere where I think this is pretty clearly the way you have to read it. He says, now kvar batla avodat ha'elilim, the worship of idols has disappeared and the religions have undergone transformation.
Hadar is now on 93rd Street, and our new location is directly next door to a church. And I was passing by that church. There's a big poster out front with the name of a lecture or a sermon that's happening. And I took a picture of it and sent it to one of my colleagues here who's a faculty and said, like, oh, this sounds like the title of your lecture that you just gave. Is like something that happens actually sort of regularly with that church, that I see their values, their messaging on the outside of the building. And I think, oh, they're doing what we're doing. They're just doing it in a different context. They are working towards the same things we are. They have the same values displayed. So in that way, this feels very intuitive to me. Yeah, we're all working towards the same goal. But I don't think I would say that about every church in the country. There are certainly churches in this country that I don't feel shared values with, that I think I might have a harder claim saying, like, broadly, all religion is now safe.
Right. So this is the sort of schematic thing, right? Which is to say, well, the third option in the schema is everyone is no longer an idolater, right? Christianity is not. You can, of course, sort of any given person can individually mix and match on this and say, oh, well, I feel this way about Catholics. I don't feel this way about this group of Protestants or this church that has this kind of politics or what. You won't find that in the Meiri. But for sure, right, the models here are not ones you can't imagine mixing and matching in some way. You have some Unitarian Christians who see Jesus as a prophet, but don't think of him as part of the Godhead at all. Obviously, if the theology is driving you, well, that's pretty different than someone believing in the Trinity.
Right. When this is a thought experiment, it feels to me like, yeah, we should do that. We should just be thoughtful. We should pay attention. We should make decisions based on the actual church and not categorically church with a capital C.
That is an approach that any number of people take, right? That is one halachic approach, is to evaluate different churches, different sects, different creeds, and to try to figure out which context makes a difference. I mean, among the people who take sort of the Meiri's general approach, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who's a very recent posek, he says straight up in a tshuva that he writes, he says, the Christians of today, they don't really believe in more than one God anymore. And even though they pray to other things, I'm telling you, theologically, they pray to those things as intermediaries, but not really as gods. He doesn't say this, but I would add this. He's trying to make some kind of claim of, they may pray to Jesus, and some Jews pray to angels, and maybe we don't like that or think it should be scaled back, but it's not idolatry.
Right. It's a little bit tricky because here, the excuses I'll make to myself to allow me to show up at your wedding are kind of undermining your religion. I'm like, well, you don't really believe Jesus is God, so I can come to your wedding. And you might say, no, really, I do believe that Jesus is God. Please stay home.
Yes. So, right. If you get it wrong, as it were, from the other person's frame of reference, that feels like a big deal and maybe unsuccessful. I guess I would just add this. This is my perspective on all this material. A lot of this on the explicit level is formulated as a theological assessment. And it's set up as assess whether it's idolatry. And then figure out how you proceed, right? And I think when you look at how some of this emerges and the rhetoric even that's actually used, I think I'm just giving you descriptively. This is not a normative claim. I think descriptively it usually goes the other way, which is to say people have some sense of the people that they like, trust somewhat, feel commonality with, have intertwined lives with. And then there's pressure to figure out, is there a way for me to understand this person as not being an idolater?
Mm-hmm.
You need to do that with some integrity, at least some integrity to your own frame of reference, even if it's not perfect for theirs. But I think that's often what's going on. I think it's quite plain. We know the Meiri and other places, he refers to a friar who was in his neighborhood who he used to discuss questions of repentance with. Like he has a collegial relationship with a Christian clergyman.
Yeah, that's cool.
And that is part and parcel of what's going on. I don't think Rabbeinu Tam had some great love of the Christians that he lived near, but he did feel he had to be in business with them. And it felt important to be able to tell a narrative where I don't need to have a life that is completely severed from yours. The Rambam, living in Islamic lands, can much more freely say, I don't need to make any accommodation to these people. I find the theology offensive, and there's really no pressure.
Yeah.
Right? There's no lever on me.
There's no interest in it.
Yeah. So I don't mean this in a cynical way of, they had a pressure, they had to solve it. I just mean it in more of a genuine way. When you go back and look at the Bible's seething anger about idolatry, I don't think you can separate it from the fact that they also thought those people were horrible people. They talk about them that way. The Tanakh, the Nevi'im, they don't just talk about these people as like, you're a wonderful person. Unfortunately, you violated a theological dogma that's
like
dear to me.
These people have disrespect for God, and that also plays out in disrespect for humans, for the way they behave.
Think of them as violent and murderers and sexually immoral. It's all a package. You can't find anywhere in the Tanakh talking in a lauding way about someone of another faith, but who nonetheless you're drawing some like horrible line with them because of their idolatry. It tends to go as a package, and I think that goes the other way too. So I don't mean just because the questioner says, this is my friend, well, therefore they can't be an idolater. But I think it is fair to say it is important that one of the baselines of the question is clearly the questioner feels that their Christian friend is a decent person, an ally in building a society, someone whose wedding they want to go to. And that, I think, is inevitably going to have an influence on where do you categorize Christianity. And I think what we've been able to share here is there's these three categories, and different poskim have fallen in different ones of them.
And is this the kind of thing where we could map out these different poskim, and that doesn't always leave us with a like, well, you as an individual should decide. Sometimes it's like consult your local rabbi and see what your practice is, or does your family have a practice, or how do you advise people actually make these determinations for themselves if they don't have a clear inherited practice already?
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's complicated. I also think, if we're honest, sometimes the question is coming to us with a real desire to be guided what to do. And sometimes the question is coming to us in the form of, I'm pretty sure I'm going to this wedding. Do you have any language to make me feel like I'm not just violating what I grew up with? So the second question is sort of easier in that if it's like, look, you're telling me you already decided to do this. You should know there are significant poskim, right, who approach that way. You have reports by Rav Moshe Chazan of a very important rabbi in Rome who would like regularly go into churches to hear the melodies of the choirs and to learn them and to see maybe some of them could be applied to Jewish worship. There are figures of that sort. And sure, that might be relevant. I think if you're asking, from the outset, look, if you're asking my broad opinion, I do find the Meiri compelling on a broad level, which is to say, essentially, people who are decent people with whom you feel you are building a society. You have shared theological language. It feels like the role that religion plays in their life is to tame the things that would otherwise be wild about the human being, to rein in violence, to build up morality, all of that. There should be ways that we are able to be in fellowship with those people, with, whatever the boundaries are that we always need for Jewish distinctiveness. I think the forms of wedding, can also be different. A Catholic wedding, that's a mass, that's asking everyone to witness at some point or inviting people to kneel at some point. Like, that can be trickier. You can sometimes, in fact, be co-opted, right, into someone else's worship service. And that a little bit has to be negotiated case by case. But in principle, I would like to have an outlook where the wider we can draw the circle without being dishonest of who are fellow travelers in the path of faith, that's my inclination. But I never want to tell someone to sort of surrender a theological boundary they were raised with.
Especially if it's meaningful to them.
Yeah, that they still find compelling just in the name of, getting along. And here's where, just to sort of briefly...
Which is sort of the inverse. If actually you really don't want to go to this person's wedding, you feel bad about it, but that's just, you were raised not to go into churches, there's also footing for you.
Yeah.
To say to that friend, this is my tradition. I'm sorry.
That's right. And this goes briefly to, the second component here, which is, well, let's say you didn't get over the hurdle. Let's say you didn't get to the Meiri, right? Mm-hmm. And you're either with the Rambam or Rabbeinu Tam. Because even for Rabbeinu Tam, it's idolatry for you, right? Even according to Rabbeinu Tam, there's not really a basis for you can't participate in Christianity at all. So can you go into that building? Is there a way of saying, this is idolatry, but I nonetheless can go into the building? And if you probe this, right, the origin of the ban on walking into a house of worship, of an idolatrous house of worship, it's not totally clear in the Talmud. It's obviously kind of intuitive if the Tanakh talks about, like, if you have the ability, you should destroy those shrines. Yeah. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense to say, no problem, right? Walk into them. But assuming you don't want to have the power to destroy them, and it's just about, being on your guard, there's various sources that are invoked to say it's inappropriate to go in. The dominant view is to say, why are you not allowed even to enter? For reasons of suspicion of you, which is to say, people will think, and maybe you yourself will be seduced into an act of worship. And so then, as you can imagine, all kinds of poskim will say, well, if the context is very clear that that's not what's going on, then it's okay. Rav Rabinovich, who I quoted, will say, an Israeli tour guide can bring people into churches to see what's happening there. It's obvious he's leading a tour. He's got the special hat, or whatever it is. You'll have this come up with, can you go and vote in a church? Yeah. Right? And there'll be poskim that will say, yeah, everyone understands it. It's election day.
I was going to ask about this even for, occasions, a minyan or a school that might be renting space from a church, like a Jewish worship space. It's like, well, you're clearly there for the high holiday service that was renting that church venue.
Correct. So in a way that's mitigating, in a way that's aggravating, and that you're actually going in to do a religious action, and then you're doing it in that building as opposed to voting or having a bake sale, right, or whatever it is. It comes up in state functions. There's a presidential funeral in the National Cathedral, and the rabbis of the community are invited along with the Christian and Muslim clergy, etc. Again, there will be voices that will say, well, in that context, everyone understands what's going on. It's a funeral. There are many that held the line, like Rav Ovadia Yosef, sort of not surprising, as a Sfaradi descendant of the Rambam, is totally uncompromising on Christianity. He says you can never go into a church no matter what. I think even the lenient views on this in some of the cases we're talking about, they're not going to say you can go into a church just not to make a fight with your friend. That is to say, the category of mishum eva.
Like, because I'll hurt her feelings is not a reason to compromise something that you really believe is wrong.
And really believe is idolatry,
yeah.
right? On some level. And I actually think that's right. Like the mishum eva, the fear of offending someone, that'll come in where, the Talmud will say, oh, you can't go to a party of an idolater because by showing up, they might thank their idol in your name or something like that. There, some poskim will say, all right, if it's going to cause a major fight, who knows if they're really going to thank the idol, it's okay. But you're talking about something where if I would ask you point blank, do you believe that if you were to worship in this building, it would be an act of idolatry? And you're like, oh, 100% I do. I'm not sure the basis for going to the wedding is I don't want to make my friend feel bad.
Yeah.
And I think then you're either negotiating a place where you say, yeah, we actually have a divide on this. It's not actually appropriate for me to go to this space. Or you're going to push yourself into the direction, which again, I already said I'm sympathetic to, of, I don't know that I really think this is idolatry.
Yeah.
And that's part and parcel of how I'm navigating this. In some level, I might also say to you, I don't know, is that maybe also part of the reason you're friends with this person? Which is to say, you don't think they're doing something terrible and awful.
Right.
But it can be complex. And as always, as we say on this show, we don't want to presume all the variables that we don't always know, right, from the question.
I think we'll close here and we'll offer a hope that the listener finds the right path forward that feels right for them. And that all of us continue to, I'll use your language, to look for the places of commonality and to not lose ourselves and our individuality in the process. Have a halachic question you'd like answered on the show? Email us at responsa@hadar.org. Responsa Radio is a project of the Hadar Institute. Thanks to Chana Kupetz and Jeremy Tabick for producing this podcast and to David Khabinsky for recording and editing this episode.